In this game, you don't lose your gear when you die. How can that be, I hear you ask, and I get it, because at first I thought exactly the same thing. I've played 10,000 hours of Escape from Tarkov and most other extraction shooters under the sun, and this is the biggest thing that separates STALZONE from all of them. When you die, you get to keep your armor and your weapons. At first, I simply couldn't understand how this could possibly work. Surely the whole point of an extraction shooter is risking everything. But the mistake that most people make, including myself, is thinking that STALZONE is trying to be Tarkov, or even S.T.A.L.K.E.R. It isn't. This video is sponsored by STALZONE, but you can't get to grips with the whole game in just one session. So when Expo the devs originally approached me, we decided to make it into a full series so I can actually experience what the game properly has to offer. Inevitably, the first couple of hours are mostly about figuring out how everything actually works, but even from the opening tutorial, I realised that this wasn't quite the game that I was expecting. Instead of just dropping you into the zone and letting you figure it out for yourself, there's actually a proper narrative introduction. You start inside the Chernobyl nuclear power station, learning the basics of healing, combat and movement whilst trying to escape, before things very quickly take a turn. Without spoiling too much, your own boss ends up betraying you, and after waking up somewhere completely different, you're immediately faced with the biggest decision you'll make at the start, which is choosing whether to join the Stalkers or the Bandits. From what I can tell so far, this doesn't massively change the core gameplay, but it does completely change the story that you're following and the faction that you'll be fighting alongside. I went with the Bandits because I quite liked the idea of playing the anti-hero rather than the good guys, but at this point I still thought I was basically playing Tarkov with a story attached to it. Then I woke up in the first hub area. Suddenly there were dozens of other players running around, organising their stash, picking up quests, speaking to traders and heading out into the world. You've got storage, merchants, crafting and even a player-driven auction. This was probably the first moment that I realised that STALZONE wasn't trying to recreate a raid-based extraction shooter at all. After grabbing the first few quests and eventually figuring out how to stop punching pigs in the face instead of shooting them, the real gameplay loop started to reveal itself. Every area has a handful of important crafting resources, and in the swamps there are two that matter more than anything else, one from the mutants and one from the human camps, in my case fighting AI stalkers. Very quickly you realise that the biggest bottleneck is these resources, and the most important part of the progression is about deciding which upgrades you want to invest those resources in. At first I thought I was going to grab a bit of everything, the starter SMG, an assault rifle, a sniper rifle, but it didn't take long to realise that that's actually a terrible idea. The barter tree for upgrades is absolutely massive, and unlike typical extraction games, you can't skip ahead and loot the gun that you really want. So the fastest way to progress is to pick a weapon family, commit to it and basically ignore everything else. For me, that meant moving straight towards the AK-74 line while keeping a shotgun as my secondary. Speaking of shotguns, I thought I would barely use one. I'm not much of a shotgun player in general, but after about 30 minutes of gameplay, I completely changed my mind. Mutants are absolutely everywhere in the zone, and while an assault rifle will eventually deal with them, a shotgun is dramatically more efficient. Before long, I found myself using the AK for people and the shotgun for almost everything else with 4 legs. By this point, I was starting to understand the basic gameplay loop, but what I hadn't realised was that the biggest threat wasn't actually the mutants, it was the zone itself. Like the S.T.A.L.K.E.R games, this world is full of environmental hazards. Radiation, biological contamination, thermal zones, psychic anomalies, vortices that launch you into the air. There is always something trying to kill you, even when there aren't any enemies around. Fortunately, your suit gives you a bit of warning. As you get close to different hazards, you'll hear warning beeps and can even throw bolts ahead of you to help identify dangerous anomalies, which was a really nice nod to the original S.T.A.L.K.E.R games. But before long, you hit your first proper progression wall. The basic armor that you start with simply isn't good enough to keep pushing through the story. At this point, veteran players all seem to recommend exactly the same thing: forget the next gun and rush the science suit instead. It's initially quite hard to turn to the outfit with even less combat protection, but once I looked at how the armor system actually works, it made a lot more sense. There are 3 main armor classes in STALZONE. Combat suits are exactly what they sound like. They're designed for surviving gunfights. Science suits sacrifice some combat effectiveness in exchange for much higher protection against the zone itself. This allows you to enter areas that would otherwise slowly or quickly kill you. Then, sitting somewhere in the middle are combo suits, which offer a balance between the two and are probably what most players end up using through the first part of the early game. It's interesting because you have some definite choices as the player, and more armor isn't necessarily the answer. For me, the science suit became the first major milestone, which represented access to the next stage of the game. Although getting the science suit is critical for going further, it also means pushing further north, and that's where STALZONE really starts changing. Looking at the map, you've effectively got bandit territory to one side, stalker territory to the other, and as both factions start expanding towards the middle, you're much more likely to run into players from the opposing team. And unlike the swamps, where I could happily farm for quite a while without seeing another player, these encounters suddenly became much more frequent. As you can probably tell, neither me nor the duo were expecting a fight, and somehow both sides managed to escape with our lives. At this point, I hadn't even realised you get a spawn protection for a certain amount of time when leaving an instanced area, and considering that I was still running around with the fairly basic SMG, I probably wasn't winning that fight anyway if they'd pressed it. But what I found really interesting was that once PvP starts becoming part of the game, it never really feels forced. You're simply trying to complete your own objectives, knowing that somebody else might be trying to do exactly the same thing, and it's this emergent gameplay that makes the environment work so well. Do you clear one more camp, or do you bank everything you've collected and head back to safety before someone hears your gunfire? Because that's another thing that STALKERCraft does super well. The AI is there to facilitate farming resources and to create noise. Every firefight, every mutant you've just blasted with a shotgun, every camp you've cleared is announcing your position to everyone else nearby. It's a clever way of naturally creating player encounters without forcing them. You always feel like you're making your own decisions, but there's just enough risk in the background that every farming run stays interesting. One mechanic I genuinely haven't seen in another extraction game is the player detector built into your suit. Rather than give you a minimap full of enemy markers, it simply tells you how many players are nearby. Normally, you'll see just a 1 in the corner representing yourself. Then suddenly, now it's 2. Somebody else has entered your detection radius. The clever part is that it doesn't tell you who they are. It could be another bandit, someone on my team, or it could be a stalker, an enemy. You have no idea until you actually spot them. It sounds like a small feature, but it completely changes how you move around the world and engage with PvP. Every time that counter changes, you're suddenly on high alert, and the choice to either run or see if you can spot them first becomes the number 1 priority. But despite all of that, I still had one big question. If nobody drops their weapons or armor, and if you can't just steal somebody else's progression, why bother fighting at all? That was probably the biggest misconception I had coming into STALZONE. After thousands of hours playing Tarkov, PvP has always been about taking somebody else's loot and progressing yourself at their expense. STALZONE works completely differently. It wasn't until I got my first player kill that I finally understood what was going on. Instead of dropping all their crafting materials onto the ground for anyone to take, those resources are bundled together into a bag that's linked to the player who owned them. You'd naturally think that you can open it up and use everything inside for your own progression, but you actually can't. Those materials are still bound to the original player. However, you can keep the bag, and if that player wants their crafting materials back, they can buy it back from you through the in-game auction house. This is such a clever compromise. Winning PvP still matters because you can make money from the fights. Losing PvP still hurts because you've interrupted your farming run and might have to spend some of your hard-earned rubles getting those materials back from another player, if at all. But crucially, nobody can steal hundreds of hours of permanent progression from you in one unlucky fight. And it's only then that I finally understood why the game is designed the way it is. The tension comes from asking one simple question every time you're out in the world. Do I push my luck, or do I head back now? That little decision happens constantly. You've just cleared another mutant camp, you've almost got enough resources for your next upgrade, and then you notice another event just over the hill, and the base is far enough away to make it a bit of a slog to go back. Maybe you can squeeze in one more. Maybe you can't. And that's exactly where STALZONE creates its tension, by constantly tempting you to stay out just that little bit longer. After about 20 hours so far, I think the biggest surprise for me is how all of these systems fit together in a way that I really haven't seen before. When I first heard that you don't lose your weapons or armor when you die, I honestly thought that it would remove all of the tension, but instead it's almost done the opposite. Because your permanent progression is always moving forwards, every run out into the zone still feels worthwhile, even if things don't quite go to plan. You might lose some crafting materials, some time, or have to buy your backpack back from another player, but you never feel like one unlucky death has completely wiped out everything that you've worked towards. I think that's probably why this game works so well for solo players and for more casual players too. You can jump on for an hour, make some meaningful progress towards your next upgrade, and then log off feeling like you've actually achieved something. But at the same time, the PvP still has a purpose. You're fighting over farming routes, outposts, and slowing down the other faction while speeding up your own progression. And because of the gear-based matchmaking, I never really felt like I was constantly being thrown against people with hundreds of hours more progression than me. This is probably the single biggest reason that STALZONE can get away with the permanent progression is through this matchmaking, and it's a very different feeling to most extraction shooters that I've played. The other thing that I really liked was how alive the world feels. You're constantly seeing other bandits running back to base with full backpacks, people grouping up for quests, and players heading out into the zone. Once you're there are random firefights breaking out in the distance and AI patrols all around the map. It genuinely feels like you're part of something much bigger than your own character, and it's a lot less lonely than a game like Escape from Tarkov. And I think that that's probably the biggest lesson that I've learned so far. When I first started playing, I kept trying to compare STALZONE to Tarkov, but the more I've played, the more I've realised that that was just the wrong comparison. STALZONE is much less an extraction shooter with MMO elements, but really an MMO that uses extraction mechanics to make the progression exciting. and I've never really played anything quite like it. So now that the science suit is finally built, the next area is unlocked, and that's where the game really starts opening up. We're finally heading towards the bar to see whether that's actually true.
Маслину хапнешь, кет! Как же мне тут все остопиздило!
STALZONE itself is completely free to play. You can use the link in the description alongside my bonus welcome code to grab some extra starter rewards, and if you're already playing, I would love to hear what you think of the progression system compared to other extraction games. So as always, a big shout out to all my patrons, and as usual, have fun in your raids.